Dale Hanson Bourke is the president of the CIDRZ Foundation, which supports AIDS research and treatment programs in Africa. A woman of endless energy and commitment, Dale has traveled and worked in Africa and has written 2 books to share what she has learned about poverty and AIDS: The Skeptic's Guide to the Global AIDS Crisis and The Skeptic's Guide to Global Poverty. She has also written another book, which some of you may have picked up on the book table, called Second Calling: Finding Passion and Purpose for the Rest of Your Life. So when it comes to passion and purpose, Dale walks the walk. Let's welcome Dale Hanson Bourke.
We've talked about stories a lot, and Wendy has asked me to share a little bit about my own story. And what I have learned as I look at my own life is that God is always at work, but I almost always am missing the point. And perhaps you've had that experience. What I so often lack is perspective. And it often takes me months or years, and sometimes even decades, to see God's hand weaving together the various threads into a pattern of my life. And to me, so often those threads look random. I can't see them. I can't see how they're ever going to connect. I can't see how anything is ever going to come of them. Sometimes I even mistake them for lint. And I'll pick up a piece made of a strange and irritating color and try to get rid of it. And later I'll look back and realize that was the very color that was being woven into my life to give it interest and to really create a unique pattern. And perhaps you have been able to see this as well. Stories are my way of seeing these patterns, of being able to hear more than the cacophony of our daily conversations, of being able to really look back and put it all together. And when I tell stories about myself, it's not because I'm so fascinated with myself. I have a pretty boring life by most of your standards. But I am fascinated by how God works and how incredible it is that He pulls together these things. For me, most of my stories are some version of once I was blind, but now I see. I can look back and say, oh, I didn't see that at all, and now I see it. Thank you. Thank you. So now that I have the perspective of 5 decades, I'm seeing quite a pattern, and I'd like to share a few learnings from my own life with you to encourage you to think about your life as well. Stories, I believe, are meant to bring us together. Stories of great accomplishment, if I were to stand up here and tell you about the things that I think were really important in my life, would probably not do that. But stories that reveal our places of fear, of fracture, of failure, those are often the stories that really help us to relate to one another. And since I was an English major in college, you'll notice that those were alliterative as well. As a child, I'll tell you a story about each of one of those in my life. As a child, the storytelling tradition in my church was often called testimony. Perhaps it was in your church as well. And one of the most memorable childhood memories for me was something called Mission Emphasis Week, when the missionaries would come to our church and tell us their stories. And as a child, my perspective maybe was a little skewed, but the stories all sounded pretty grim to me. They were stories about people who didn't like you, people who didn't want you to be there, people who were in some cases very hostile to you. But mostly what I remember about these stories was snakes. I remember there were always snakes in these stories. And I remember one time during Mission Emphasis Week, somebody actually brought a snake skin and unrolled it in front of our church. It just kept going on and on forever. And that just did it for me. I just knew that the last thing in the world I would ever want to do was be a missionary in Africa. And furthermore, I think my marketing instincts were starting to be honed because I kept thinking, you mean they think you'd want to do this after telling us these stories? I just, I didn't get it at all. But I was also kind of confused about what calling meant. And in my childhood mind, when I would see people going down the aisle crying, I would think, oh, they're crying because they really don't want to do this, but God's making them do this. This is all the, strange skewing of a childhood mind. So I came up with a way to overcome this. Whenever there was an altar call and they asked if you wanted to be a missionary, and taking no chances, I would grip the pew in front of me and hold on for dear life because I wasn't sure. I thought maybe God just made your feet go forward. And even worse, I had this other theory. I mean, really, my imagination was really kind of strange, but I thought that God's way of finding new missionaries, if he didn't go forward, was that at night when everybody was sleeping and unsuspecting, God would look down on the world and sort of go, okay, I need another missionary, I'll pick that one. And so I slept every night with my head under the covers, trying to hide from God. Now, there's a big metaphor going on here, you'll notice. But as a child, this was really my big fear, honestly. I mean, I was really, really afraid that God would make me go to Africa. Well, as you may have heard in my introduction, I go to Africa a lot now. And ironically, or perhaps more than ironically, I love going to Africa now. God has actually taken what was that great fear and changed my heart to the point where when I go to Africa, it feels like home now. I love my friends in Africa. I would love to live there someday. I still have to convince my husband of that. But I have had that childhood memory and that fear actually turned around by God in a way that is just really amazing to me when I look back. Now, it wasn't a simple or a quick path, because really my fear had to be overcome by a fracture in my life. And so often that happens. Our lives are fractured, and it changes everything. And my fracture occurred early in my adult life. I remember hearing people talk for many, many years about how many children, how many babies died. That, you know, sometimes I heard 25 million, sometimes 30 million babies died every year from preventable causes. And it was just this sort of massive statistic that I couldn't get my head around and I didn't really pay attention to. And then my story intersected with a statistic, and I became part of that statistic. I lost a baby, and in that moment, I began to realize that this was not just a number. These women had those same emotions that I had, the same feelings that I had. And it was enough for me to say, I want to know more. I want to know how to change that. I want to know how to help other women not go through that. And so that's what first took me to a poor country. I was 35 before I ever went to a developing country, something that I share with you because some of you who are new will come to this and think that all of us who've been involved in opportunity were sort of born to be involved in these causes and maybe, you know, always wanted to do this kind of thing. I didn't. I was very afraid. The first time I went overseas, the first time I went to a poor country, I was afraid of how I would feel, how I'd react. Would it be too much for me? Would it overwhelm me? And something that I think a lot of people go through before they take their first trip to a developing world country. They don't know how they're going to react, and they're worried about it. I went to the poor country. The first one was Guatemala, and then went on to Africa. And the more I went, the more I learned, and the more I realized about what was going on. And it was, in many ways, a healing, both of my fear, but of also of that fracture, that point of pain in my life, of losing that baby, and also then learning that there were things we could do to help other women not lose babies. And it was a really wonderful and powerful experience of healing. I still don't like snakes, but I do like to go to Africa. And then many years later, I had a call from my marketing director, Carrie Sleece, and she asked if I would meet somebody from Opportunity, a woman named Urbina who was working for Opportunity at that point in Uganda. And she asked if I would come and have coffee with her. And I was very busy that day. I had a lot of things on my to-do list I needed to cross off. And I was somewhat impatient at the idea of going and spending time. And I think I probably gave Carrie a bit of a hard time and said, all right, well, I've got, 15 minutes, maybe half an hour I can spend. And one of my learnings from life is this: whenever I am too impatient and I feel like I'm too busy to do something, God is about to do something really big in my life, and I really should just cool it, because I'm going to be really embarrassed later when I look back and see how I was so sure that I had to get something else done. So I went and had coffee with this woman named Urbina. And Carrie had an emergency. She had to leave, and I thought, uh-oh, I'm going to be stuck here for a long time. And I was more impatient, and I tried to be polite, and I asked Urbina all the questions I could about her country. And she was a person who was an expert on AIDS. I didn't know much about AIDS at that point. I just knew, again, big numbers. Millions of people dying, didn't really understand it, didn't know enough about it, didn't even know how to ask intelligent questions about it, to be honest. And so after asking as much as I could possibly come up with, I finally said to Urbina, tell me about yourself. Tell me your story. Well, of course, that's where we should always start with people, but I was too impatient that day to go there first. And I said, do you have children? And Urbina said, yes, I have 9 children. I said, 9 children? She didn't look old enough to have, more than 1 or 2. And I said, wow, 9 children. I mean, how old are you? How in the world do you have 9 children? And Urbina paused, and she looked at me, and she said, well, I have 1 child of my own, but I'm raising 8 of my nieces and nephews because, you see, my sisters and brothers have all died of AIDS. And suddenly that statistic became the story. And her story was the embodiment of what we had been talking about. And as she began to tell me the story of AIDS ravaging her family and her village, she began to cry, and I began to cry. And I was just so taken by the fact that this was such an overwhelming problem, and this beautiful young woman was dealing with this. And I felt very sort of helpless to help her. I felt like a failure. I said, oh, Urbina, I wish there was something I could do. And she paused, and she looked at me, and she said, Dale, of course there's something you can do. You must pray and ask God what it is. And it was so strong and so clear that I went home and I started to pray. And I thought, well, my way of praying often is to tell God what I think he needs to know. So I said, well, God, if you want me to give more money to Opportunity, okay, I'll see if I can do that. If you want me to, whatever it is, I'll try to do it. Of course, if he had told me what he really had in store for me, I never would have believed it. But I started to look around and look for a book that I could read about AIDS. I thought, I need to know more. And I couldn't find anything simple enough for me. I literally was so uneducated about the whole subject that I needed to find something very simple. And when I couldn't find something simple enough, circumstances worked together, and I ended up writing this book. It was just really pretty amazing. And then I ended up starting a project called the AIDS Orphan Bracelet Project. And then, fast forward, I work now for one of the largest AIDS treatment programs in the world, where, by the way, our emphasis is on women's health, and we have the doctors in our program have tested and treated nearly 1 million women, pregnant women, to help them be able to have their babies healthy and to prevent them from passing HIV/AIDS on to their babies. So as I look back and I think all of those little pieces that God has put together in such a marvelous and incredible way, it humbles me, it amazes me, and it makes me encourage you to take a look at your own life, at those places where maybe they aren't the things you'd put on your resume. They're the places where you've had your failures, you've had your fractures, you've had your fears, and begin to understand how God can work through those and what God can do with you. And I'd like to just end with 2 things. I want to read you a blessing that was actually read in one of our Opportunity board meetings one year and is so wonderful that I want to leave this with you. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may wish for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. It's a Franciscan blessing. And I also want to remind you of the words of Urbina, and as you leave today, suggest you do this. If you're asking yourself after all this, what could I possibly do? I would just remind you, of course, there's something you can do, and you must pray and ask God what it is. So thank you very much for being here and for what you will do in the future.